Okay, folks, we are getting so close to our finale of this Mexico unit. Um, this screencast is since 1990, part two. So make sure you watch part one first. Going to be a lot of text in this one, not a lot of images. Sorry about that, but there's just a lot I want you to remember and be able to get down on your note guide. So let's check it out. Okay, essential questions. I just read these in part one, so I'm not going to read them again. Let's go to the relationship with the United States for most of the 20th centuries. They viewed us as an enemy. So we think of ourselves, oh, nice United States. We're a really friendly country, home of the free, land of the brave. Well, they remember that we invaded them in 1846 and took a bunch of their land. They also remember that we have a lot of economic power. Our economy is 10 times the size of theirs, and we can leverage that against them and sort of use the try to bully them into doing things we want them to do. So both of these are tough. We can't travel back in time and undo the war, and we do have leverage over them in trade negotiations because our economy is so big. So they're a lot more dependent on us because they do a lot more business with us. As a percentage of their economy, business with us is very big versus us with them. Immigration is still an issue, a big issue, as many of you probably know, and we could spend like an entire week or two talking about immigration. I don't have time to go into it all in this unit, but we might have another separate unit on it, or maybe we've already done that, depending on when you're watching the screencast. So in Mexico, from the Mexican perspective, there's all those indigenous people and the small landowners who've been forced off their land. They're working in cities at very low wage jobs with hard working conditions and long hours. They don't have a lot of great options. And so they will risk coming to the US. They will risk getting arrested to find a better life. It's difficult to solve this issue. One thing for Mexicans that is helpful is that when their family members come to the US and get a job, they often send most of their profits back in the mail to Mexico. So when you send the money back home, that's called a remittance. And so the remittances really help out the family members back home, pay for basic things like clothing and water and food, and education. So the remittances are something that's important. Another reason it's difficult to solve immigration issues is that a lot of people in the U.S., some people in the U.S., fear that there's a link between Mexican immigrants and drugs and crime. In drugs and crime, there's certainly problems in Mexico, so I don't know exactly how much they're linked, but there's a perception that they are linked. Okay, what about today in Mexico? Social challenges. Drugs and crime are a major challenge in Mexico today. Incidentally, a lot of the drugs coming through Mexico are driven by American demand. Americans are using a lot of drugs, and so Mexico is supplying them. 77% of the cocaine that Americans use comes through Mexico. It's usually made in South America, but it comes through Mexico. Mexican drug cartels also smuggle marijuana, heroin, and synthetic drugs like meth. Incidentally, it's very hard to buy guns in Mexico. So there's a trade where they're getting guns from us. In 2008, there was a big raid where the Mexican government confiscated a bunch of guns, and 90% of them were American guns. So we're doing business with them. We're buying the drugs. We're selling them guns. They're selling. It's a really nasty situation. Why is it so difficult to solve some of the drug problems? Number one is that the drug cartels make so much money, they can buy government officials like police officers, politicians, border agents, and judges. So they can pay people in government positions not to arrest them, to help them at the border, to rule that they are innocent when they're convicted of a crime, to pass certain laws. They have a lot of influence with all of the drug money that they have. The violence is hard to root out. Since 2006, they think that there's about 60,000 victims of violent crime related to drugs. And that's because the drug cartels, if there's two cartels and they have a disagreement, they can't go to court and work it out. They fight each other, and they're fighting over territory, and the fighting gets pretty fierce. Sometimes innocent bystanders are caught up in the violence also. Oddly, sometimes the cartels some people look up to them in Mexico. There's kind of this tradition in Mexico of looking up to like the Pancho Villa, who was a criminal, and then he became a political leader. So they're kind of glorified as being these independent fighters, and they're sticking it to the government, and they're fighting the U.S., and I don't know, it's kind of weird, but there's a little bit of a small segment of the culture that kind of glorifies the drug cartels. Another challenge socially for Mexico is the challenge of violence. As I was just mentioning, the cartels use violence to stop their competitors, and also they use the money to buy cops, politicians, and judges. Some law enforcement officials actually help the cartels. So if there's going to be a military raid on a cartel, if one person in the military is working for the cartel, he can call them in advance and say, watch out, you're going to be raided on Friday night. So that's kind of how some of the corruption works. Same thing with the law enforcement. If the police are going to raid, one corrupt policeman can ruin the raid. Oddly, when the U.S. started its war on drugs, like in the 80s and 90s, violence increased. And corruption got worse. So sometimes when you think you're doing something to help, it ends up making it worse. And I don't know all the details of how that happened, but that's how it happened. Okay, another challenge socially in Mexico today is land reform. As you know, peasants and indigenous peoples have been pushed off their land for a couple of centuries. They keep trying to get it back, but rich landowners, wealthy elites, keep getting more land. So in Mexico today, a quarter of the population is rural. Many of them don't have electricity or running water, and often school is not available, or they can't afford it. This is mostly in southern and central regions of Mexico, where you still have subsistence farming. That's farming where they get enough crops just to feed themselves. And in Mexico, it has one of the largest percentage of people who are indigenous. So 30% of the population is still indigenous, and they tend to be much more poor than everyone else. Obviously, not everybody, but there's a tendency. So all of these problems with land reform are difficult to resolve because wealthy landowners want to keep their land, and they have political power, and they're intelligent, and they can fund politicians who will put in policies to protect them. Okay, so we will be looking at these modern issues Mexico faces. We will be discussing them. We want to get inside the mind of the Mexican people and advocate for what we think would be best for their country. All right, that's it. If you have any questions, email me or see me in class.